Hello, this is Eric White. This screencast is the first in a multi-part series on Open XML Word Processing ML. In these screencasts, I'm going to be talking about the markup of Open XML Word Processing ML. I'll be talking about all of the various parts that you'll encounter in a Word Processing ML document, and I'll be talking about the relationships between all of those parts. Open XML is based on the Open Packaging Conventions. If you're not familiar with the Open Packaging Conventions, I've recorded a screencast that tells you really what you need to know about OPC. You don't need to view that screencast before you view this screencast, although it might be helpful. If you don't view it before you view this screencast, I recommend that after you watch this screencast, go take a look at that screencast. To start, I'm going to create a Word Processing ML document. I'll create a new Microsoft Word document. I'll open the document and I'll insert a single paragraph with a single sentence in it. I'll save it and close it. I'm going to drag that document to Visual Studio and examine the document in the Open XML Package Editor Power Tool for Visual Studio 2010. You can download the Power Tool at this link. To start with, we're going to look at the main document part. I'll format the XML. And here we can see the markup for that document that we just created. Open XML has a fair amount in common with HTML. As with HTML, Open XML has block level content and it has run level content. In the main document part for this Open XML Word Processing ML document, you can see that the root element is document. The child element under document is this element w:"body. And that is a block level content container, and beneath that body element is block level content. And what we can see in this particular circumstance is that there are two paragraphs beneath the body element. In addition, we can see that there are some section properties down here at the bottom. We'll talk about that later on in this screencast series. One of the key principles of Open XML Word Processing ML is that when you look at a paragraph, the paragraph element contains run elements, and each run element can contain w:"t elements, and these are text elements, and inside that w:"t element is a text node. The reason that Open XML has this structure is so that paragraphs can contain paragraph properties that define how the paragraph appears, and the run element can contain run properties that define how a run of text appears. While the paragraph elements match up more or less to the idea of a paragraph element in HTML, the run elements kind of match up to span elements in HTML. One of the key differences is that while span elements are optional, you can just put text directly in a paragraph. In Word Processing ML, you have to have this run element. In a little bit, we'll talk about paragraph properties and run properties, but before we get to those, let's talk about tables at a high level. I'm going to insert a very small table, 2 rows by 2 columns. I'll put a little bit of data into this table, save it, and close it. Come back over to Visual Studio, format the XML. And now what we can see is this w:"tbl element is a child of the w:"body element. We see that this table element has table properties underneath it. We'll talk about those in a bit. There's a table grid element, and there are 2 w:"tr elements. Those are the table rows. These, of course, are all analogous to what you find in HTML. And a table row contains cells. as represented by this W:(TC) element. And we can see here that this TC element has cell properties underneath it. And below the TC element, we find a paragraph element. So what we can see is, just as with the body element, this TC element is a block level content container, which means it can contain paragraphs or nested tables. There's an awful lot to know about Open XML word processing ML tables. That's going to follow in a subsequent screencast. Let's go back to our word processing ML document. I'm going to insert a paragraph before the table. I'll insert a bit of text into that paragraph. Further, I'm going to do a little bit of formatting. I'm going to say that I want this paragraph to have 10 points of space before it and 10 points of space after it. And when I click OK, we can see that that takes effect. And further, I'm going to select the second word in this paragraph. I'm going to make it bold. I'm now going to come to this table and I'm going to resize that row. Save the document, close the document, and come back over to Visual Studio and reformat the XML. And the reason that I went through all of that is that I wanted to force this document to have paragraph properties, run properties. We will see down here that the table has table properties, and underneath the table there's the row, and the row has row properties. And underneath the row there are cells, and those cells have cell properties. We see the same pattern throughout word processing ML, that many different places there are elements that have underneath them another element that contains properties about that element, and typically the name of that child element is the name of the parent element with uppercase P, lowercase r appended to the element name. Something I want to show you, this was something that was a little bit confusing to me the first time I looked at Open XML word processing ML. If I select the entire paragraph and I italicize it and save it and close it, go back to Visual Studio, reload it, reformat, and go to the beginning of the document, let's look at this first paragraph that I just modified. What we see is we see the paragraph. Below that are the paragraph properties. And below that are some run properties underneath the paragraph property. They're the same as the run properties that are below the run element down below here. But the question is, what are those run properties that are below the paragraph property? I'll show you what those are. If you turn on the ability to see paragraph marks, we can see the paragraph mark here, and those run properties that are in the paragraph properties are the run properties that apply just to this paragraph mark. Now let's step back a bit and look at the markup from a higher level, from a different point of view. The next thing that I want to show you are all the places where block level content containers occur in a word processing document. Another way to say this is, where are all the places in a word processing document that you will find paragraphs and tables? In order to talk about this in a better way, I'm going to go modify our test document. In this document, we already have a paragraph and we have a table. Next thing I'm going to do is add a header and a footer. Now I'll add an endnote and a footnote. I'll add a comment. I'm going to turn off these paragraph marks for a bit. We don't really need them at the moment. And I'm going to insert a text box. I'll save the document and close it. Go back to Visual Studio, reload it. And now if we look at the outline in the Open XML package editor, we'll see that there are quite a few additional parts in this document. Let's examine all the places where there are block level content containers. First, there is the body element in the main document part. We've already seen that. In addition, there are cells in tables. We've seen that also. Next are headers and footers. We can look at a header, and we can see that there is a paragraph element and a paragraph property element and a run element and a text element. Same thing in the footer. If we look at an end note, we can see that in the end note element, there's a paragraph element. Same thing in the footnote part. There's a footnote element that contains paragraphs. Here's the comments part, and we can see that there's a paragraph element as a child of the w:comment element. And if we go back to the main document part, we open it, and if we drop down here we can see the tx-bx content element. This is the text box content element, and it also contains a w:"p element. Here is a small fact, but it's an important fact depending on the type of processing that you will be doing with Open XML word processing ML documents. This case where there's a tx-bx content element that contains a paragraph element, if we look up here, we can see that this tx-bx content element is a descendant of a run element, which itself is a child of a paragraph element. This is the only place in word processing ML where you will find that there is a paragraph element that is a descendant of another paragraph element. In all other cases, there will be only one paragraph element at a time in the hierarchy. There are three other places that are block level content containers. First is frames. This is a rarely used feature having to do with editing HTML using Word. The glossary part is a block level content container. The glossary part is important in a couple of scenarios, but it really operates kind of behind the scenes. Here is a screencast that explores the various uses of the glossary part. And finally, there are subdocuments, which are documents that are contained in another master document. I don't tend to use subdocuments in my OpenXML development scenarios. I prefer to use techniques such as alt-chunk or to use document builder to accomplish the same goals as you might accomplish using subdocuments. Subdocuments lead to a couple of small idiosyncrasies in editing that I don't particularly care for, so I de-emphasize their use. If you want to explore these notions of block level content and run level content in more detail, some time ago I wrote an article that is published on MSDN called Mastering Text in OpenXML Word Processing ML Documents. You can find that article here. Next, I'm going to talk about a couple of small issues that, while they're not large issues, knowing about these issues can save you time when you're doing development of OpenXML. As I mentioned before, inside this text element, there are XML text nodes, and there's an interesting characteristic to those text nodes, which is that the XML space attribute is important. If you do not have an XML space attribute with the value of preserve, then in the processing of the XML, Word will strip off any spaces at the beginning and the end of the text node. Let me show you. Here is our document again. I'm going to put a single space in the second paragraph. I'm going to save it and close the document. And now I'm going to switch back over here to Visual Studio and I'll format the XML. And here you can see that second paragraph. It has an attribute on that text element, XML space equals preserve. If I were to go into this markup, delete that, and save it, and open up this document, we would find out that there is in fact now not a space in that second paragraph. One question that developers sometimes ask is, what are these RSID attributes all about? These RSID attributes are pointers into another part. They're pointers into the settings part. Down here in the settings part, we can see this W:RSIDs element and a list of the various RSIDs that are used in that document. All of the changes that are made in a particular editing session using Word are marked with the same RSID attribute. What these attributes enable is they enable the scenario where you have a source document and then two authors separately modify that source document. Because of those RSID attributes, Word is able to accurately merge those documents together. Let me show you how that works. I'll create a new document. I'll call it test1. I'll insert 3 paragraphs with a single sentence in each paragraph. Save it, close it. I'll copy test1 twice. I'll rename the first one to test2. I'll rename the second one to test3. I'll edit test2, and in test2 I'm going to add some text at the beginning of this paragraph. This was made by Eric1. Close it. I'll now edit test3, and I'll modify the second paragraph. Save it, close it. Now I'll start Word. I'll come to the Review tab. I'll click the Compare button, and I'll tell Word that I want to combine revisions from multiple authors into a single document. I'll say that the original document is test2, and we'll label unmarked changes with Eric1. And the revised document is test3, and we'll label unmarked changes with Eric2. And click OK. And now you can see that Word is able to create a combined document. It's able to figure out that the text that was added at the beginning of paragraph 1 was added by Eric1 and wasn't a part of the source document and deleted by Eric2. Those RSIDs enable this scenario. This is a fairly obscure scenario. When you are modifying Open XML documents or when you are generating Open XML documents, you often don't care about this scenario, so you often can just safely delete those RSID attributes. Deleting those RSID attributes can make it significantly easier to examine the markup sometimes. That's all I'm going to cover in this screencast. In the next screencast, we're going to take a detailed look at styles and sections. In the meantime, come back often to openxmldeveloper.org and see the new content that we're putting together. You can follow me on Twitter at EricWhiteDev. You can follow OpenXML on Twitter at OpenXMLDev. And you can see my personal blog at ericwhite.com.